It was a warm April evening in Karachi, Friday, the 20th of April, 2012. The city buzzed with life as dusk began to settle, the call to prayer echoing through humid air. At Jinnah International Airport, floodlights glowed against the tarmac as ground crews moved briskly between aircraft. Among them stood an aging Boeing 737-236A, tail number APBKC, the pride of the newly revived Bhoja Air Fleet. Inside the terminal, 121 passengers and 6 crew members prepared for a routine domestic hop north to Islamabad. It was meant to be the airline's inaugural evening service on the route, a symbolic step toward its comeback in Pakistan's crowded aviation market. For many travelers, it was an ordinary trip home for the weekend. For others, a short business flight before family time. None of them could imagine that in barely 90 minutes their journey would end in catastrophe. At 5:05 p.m., Flight 213 taxied out, engines rumbling. In the cockpit sat Captain Nasim Ahmed, a veteran pilot in his 50s with more than 10,000 hours logged, yet limited recent experience on the 737's newer automated variant. Beside him, First Officer Javed Malik, younger, eager, but trained mostly on earlier manual versions of the aircraft. They had never flown together before. 2 professionals sharing a cockpit for the first time. About to face a storm neither could truly control. Clearance came from the tower. Bhoja 213, runway 25. Left cleared for takeoff. Throttles advanced. The jet roared down the runway. Passengers felt the powerful push of acceleration, the brief moment of weightlessness as wheels left the ground. Below, Karachi's labyrinth of streets slipped into haze. Above, the aircraft climbed steadily into fading daylight. At cruising altitude, 31,000 feet, the captain eased back in his seat. The cabin lights dimmed. Flight attendants began their service. Outside, the land unfolded in quiet beauty, Sindh's plains turning into the vast Punjab farmlands. The Indus River shimmering beneath the descending sun, but hundreds of kilometers ahead, the weather was changing. In the hills around Islamabad, powerful cumulonimbus clouds were building, feeding off warm, moist air from the plains. Controllers at the capital's Benazir Bhutto International Airport watched storm cells blossom on radar screens, flashes of lightning marking a squall line crossing the final approach path to runway 30. At 6:19 p.m., Captain Nasim called approach control. The distant glow of lightning was already visible ahead. The radar in their cockpit painted thick bands of red, turbulence and precipitation warnings. The first officer voiced concern. "Sir, there's heavy weather ahead of the field." The captain studied the display, then replied calmly, "We'll see if there's a gap. Let's continue descent." Moments later, they were cleared down to FL 200, 20,000 feet. The air became rough. Streaks of lightning illuminated the cabin, drawing uneasy glances from passengers. The first officer adjusted the navigation radios for the ILS approach and confirmed they'd be flying the 1 Foxtrot arrival. Standard. But tonight the skies were anything but standard. At 6:35 p.m., Islamabad approach reported. Surface wind variable 180 to 270. 10 knots gusting 20, runway wet, light drizzle. Braking action not known. To experienced pilots, that meant caution. To Bhoja 213, it meant danger ahead. The first heavy drops splattered against the windshield. Wipers squealed across the glass as rain intensified. The storm's anvil loomed above like a mountain of ink. The aircraft's weather radar warned of turbulence directly along their path. Yet the captain pressed on. Bhoja Air's own operations manual forbade penetration of active thunderstorm cells, but turning back now would mean a costly diversion, and perhaps the embarrassment of canceling the airline's first evening run. At 6:37, the aircraft entered the storm. Instantly, it was engulfed. The cockpit shook violently as updrafts and downdrafts tossed the jet like a leaf. Rain drummed against the fuselage so loudly that crew communication became difficult. Lightning flashes blinded the pilots. The auto-throttle surged to maintain speed, but Windseer distorted every reading. The first officer called out, "Speed 220 knots." That was 30 knots above target. The captain looked startled. That can't be right, an auto-throttle is on. But the instruments were telling the truth. A powerful tailwind had driven the aircraft forward. Moments later, a gust from ahead would rob it of lift. Descending through 4,000 feet, the aircraft locked onto the ILS glide slope. Automation indicated they were on the correct path to runway 30, but inside the cockpit, configuration lagged. flaps at only 5 degrees. Gear, down. The aircraft was not yet ready for landing. The captain intended to stabilize by 1,000 feet, but the storm had other plans. Suddenly, a shrill alarm cut through the thunder. Wind shear! Wind shear! Wind shear! The computer's synthetic voice was urgent, almost pleading. The first officer reacted instantly. Go around, sir. Go around! But Captain Nassim hesitated. Years of habit on simpler aircraft had taught him to rely on his hands, not the machine. Now, automation, the very system meant to help him, was confusing, its behavior unpredictable. Believing the autopilot could ride out the turbulence, he did not disconnect. Rain pounded the windshield. The aircraft lurched violently as a downdraft slammed into it. The nose pitched up automatically, trying to maintain the glide path, but airspeed collapsed. The ground proximity warning system joined the chorus. Whoop! Whoop! Pull up! No response. In the cabin, passengers gasped as luggage shifted. The view outside was pure darkness and lightning. A few clasped their hands in prayer. Back in the cockpit, 6 seconds passed, an eternity of inaction. Neither control wheel nor column moved. The pilots were overwhelmed, spatially disoriented. When the autopilot finally disengaged, its limit exceeded. The Boeing was already sliding below the glide slope. Another warning blared. Terrain! Terrain! Pull up! The first officer's voice cracked. Go around, Captain. Go around! Still, no full power response. Throttles remained in IAS hold. The jet was sinking. A final downdraft struck like a hammer. The rate of descent spiked beyond 2,500 feet per minute. The stick shaker rattled violently, the aircraft on the verge of stall. Captain Nassim pulled back sharply. For a moment, altitude stabilized. But as the downdraft eased, the sudden nose-up attitude drove the angle of attack past critical. The aircraft shuddered. The stick shaker roared again. Instinctively, the captain pushed the nose down to regain control, a fatal reflex so close to the ground. At 6:40 p.m., Bhoja Air Flight 213, with 127 souls on board, struck a terraced field 4 kilometers southeast of Islamabad's runway. The impact tore the fuselage apart instantly. Fuel tanks ruptured, igniting a fireball that illuminated the rain-soaked night. Witnesses from nearby Corral town saw an orange flash across the hillside, followed by a deafening boom that echoed through the storm. Emergency responders raced toward the coordinates, but heavy rain and muddy roads slowed them. What they found was devastation. Fragments of aluminum scattered across farmland, small fires flickering in the drizzle. There were no survivors. The radio frequencies fell silent. In the control tower, Islamabad approach called repeatedly, Bhoja 213, Islamabad. No reply. In Karachi, Bhoja Air's operations center received the first report minutes later. Their aircraft had disappeared from radar. For a brief moment, hope flickered that it had diverted. Then came confirmation. Wreckage sighted near Rawalpindi. At the crash site, rescuers worked through the night. Umbrellas and torches illuminated twisted metal, fragments of seats, children's toys. It was a scene of heartbreak too familiar in aviation history. But for Pakistan, it was one of its darkest evenings since Air Blue Flight 202, less than 2 years before. By dawn, the fires were out. The storm had passed, but the field was silent except for the hum of investigators' generators and the cry of distant crows. News spread rapidly across the country. Television screens filled with images of burning wreckage, grieving families gathering outside Islamabad morgue. The Prime Minister ordered an immediate inquiry. Bhoja Air suspended all further flights. Somewhere amid the debris, investigators recovered the 2 black boxes, the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder. They were scorched but intact. Inside them lay the final 32 minutes of confusion, warning alarms, and missed chances that sealed the fate of Flight 213. As dawn broke over Islamabad on April 21st, the smoldering wreckage of Bhoja Air 213 stood as a symbol, not only of a thunderstorm's power, but of human limitation, over-reliance on automation, undertraining, and decisions made in seconds that cost more than a lifetime could repay. The morning after the crash was gray and heavy, the smell of burnt fuel still lingering in the cool air. Rescue workers moved carefully through the muddy fields, marking debris, collecting remains, and documenting every fragment that could tell the story of what had happened in those final moments. The scene stretched for hundreds of meters. Twisted pieces of fuselage, torn seats, fragments of personal belongings scattered among the crops. The aircraft had disintegrated on impact. There was no main fuselage left to recognize, only patterns of destruction that hinted at the violent forces involved. Investigators from the Pakistan Civil Aviation Authority arrived just after sunrise. Alongside them, police cordoned off the site while local villagers looked on in silence. The investigators knew this was not just another crash. This was the second major air disaster near Islamabad in less than 2 years. Public confidence in aviation was already fragile. Another tragedy would raise painful questions once more. Within hours, the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were flown to the CAA laboratory in Karachi. Engineers carefully cleaned their scorched surfaces, praying the memory inside had survived the fire. When the first signals came through, the team knew they had something. The last 32 minutes of Bhoja 2113's flight would soon speak again. As the playback began, the voices of Captain Nasim Ahmed and First Officer Javed Malik echoed in the lab. The tone started calm, almost routine. Radio checks, descent clearances, and weather updates. Everything seemed normal. Then, as the storm intensified, their voices began to tighten. The cockpit grew tense. The sound of rain on the windshield drowned out parts of their conversation. Warnings began to flash across the panels. "Wind shear! Wind shear!" the computer repeated. The first officer urged, "Go around, sir. Go around." The captain's voice remained strained but firm. "No, let's continue." Moments later, the GPWS alarm sounded. "Pull up! Pull up!" But there was only silence, then the rattling sound of turbulence, loose items shaking in the cockpit. Finally, the first officer's last desperate shout, "Get out! Go around!" Then, impact. In that final second of recording, investigators could hear the captain's voice cut off mid-word. The rest was static. The data from the flight recorder confirmed the pattern. The aircraft entered a violent downdraft during approach, its autopilot struggling to hold the glide path. The system tried to compensate, pitching the nose up, but in doing so, it caused the speed to drop sharply. When the captain pulled back further without adding power, the plane came dangerously close to stall. And when he pushed forward to recover, the jet was already too low to climb out. Every second showed a crew fighting the aircraft and their own confusion until there was no time left. For investigators, the question was no longer what happened, but why. Why had a professional crew flown directly into a thunderstorm against their own company's manual? Why had they ignored repeated warnings to go around? Why had the captain not taken proper wind shear recovery action? As they dug deeper, the picture darkened. Bhoja Air, once a small airline that had ceased operations years earlier, had been revived only months before the crash. The Boeing 737 involved was 28 years old, an older 236A model purchased secondhand and hastily added to the fleet. Though airworthy on paper, its avionics were more advanced than what most of Bhoja Air's pilots were trained to handle. This was the advanced version of the 737-200, with automated flight deck systems unfamiliar to those used to. Earlier manual models. Captain Nasim was an experienced pilot but had limited exposure to these automated systems. First Officer Malik had almost none. Bhoja Air had promised the Civil Aviation Authority that its crews were fully trained on this specific variant, but that turned out to be false. There had been no proper simulator sessions for wind shear recovery or for handling automation failures. The training logs, when examined, showed incomplete modules, missing signatures, and outdated certifications. Bhoja Air's management had pushed to start operations quickly, and oversight from regulators had been lax. The more investigators looked, the clearer it became. This was not just an accident of weather, it was a system failure. A storm, yes, but one made deadlier by human complacency and institutional neglect. Weeks turned into months. The wreckage was collected and analyzed piece by piece. Each component told the same story, a fully functional airplane destroyed by a series of wrong choices. The engines were delivering power. The control surfaces were intact. There was no sign of fire or explosion before impact. The cause lay entirely in the chain of decisions made inside the cockpit. The report slowly took shape. The investigators wrote that the ineffective, automated flight deck management in extreme adverse weather conditions by the cockpit crew caused the accident, but behind those technical words was a human tragedy. 127 lives, gone in a matter of seconds. As news of the findings reached the public, anger turned to grief, and grief to frustration. Families wanted accountability. Why had no one stopped the flight when storms were clearly visible on radar? Why was an inexperienced crew assigned to an aircraft variant they barely knew? Why had the Civil Aviation Authority failed to verify training claims? At Bhoja Air's small headquarters, executives faced a wave of scrutiny. The airline's management defended itself, blaming weather, fate, and unforeseen conditions. But the investigation had already revealed that their manuals were outdated, their crew selection careless, and their oversight minimal. Within weeks, Bhoja Air suspended all operations. By the following year, its license was revoked. The airline would never fly again. Meanwhile, the families of the victims gathered for memorials across the country. At Karachi, Lahore, and Islamabad airports, candlelight vigils were held. Photographs of lost loved ones, mothers, fathers, children, lined the walls. Their names were read one by one in somber prayers. Many relatives said they would never forget the date, April 20th, when the sky turned against them. In one home in Rawalpindi, a father held his daughter's school bag, recovered from the crash site. In another, a mother looked at her son's unopened wedding invitation. For them, every news update was not about investigation or aviation. It was about a person who never came home. The final report took 2 years and 9 months to complete. When it was published, it laid bare the uncomfortable truth. Bhoja Air's management had misled regulators about the crew's readiness. The Civil Aviation Authority had failed to verify critical details about training and flight deck configuration. The captain had continued into severe weather, ignoring both Boeing's and the airline's own procedures. And the first officer, though aware of the danger, lacked the authority or confidence to take control. It was a tragic mix of errors, human, institutional, and environmental, all converging in one stormy sky. Experts later explained how the Boeing's older autopilot logic had struggled in the violent wind shear. Instead of disengaging immediately, it fought to hold the glide path, confusing the crew with rapid pitch and throttle changes. But even so, Boeing's recovery procedure was simple. Disconnect automation, apply full power, pitch to 15 degrees, and climb out. That command never came. In the years that followed, the Bhoja Air disaster became a case study in pilot training and automation dependency. Aviation academies across Pakistan discussed it in classrooms, emphasizing the importance of simulator practice, crew coordination, and decision-making authority. The phrase, "go around," once just standard procedure, now carried the weight of 127 lost lives. For Captain Nassim and First Officer Malik, the blame was complicated. They were victims too, caught between an unforgiving sky and a system that had not prepared them. In their final moments, both fought to make sense of chaos their instruments couldn't interpret. And while their actions sealed their fate, they also exposed the gaps that others could finally learn from. By the 10th anniversary of the crash, a quiet memorial was held near the site. A small plaque read, "In memory of those lost on Bhoja Air Flight 213, may the lessons learned keep others safe." The hillside was green again, covered in grass, but the villagers still remembered the night when fire rained from the sky. For Pakistan's aviation community, Bhoja Air 213 became a painful reminder that safety is not built on technology alone, but on discipline, training, and the courage to say no, even when the destination is within sight. As the camera pans over Islamabad's skyline, the voice of the narrator softens. April 20th, 2012, a routine flight turned into a national tragedy. The skies above Islamabad will forever remember the flash of lightning that revealed a Boeing 737's final descent. One decision, one storm, one moment, enough to change everything. Bhoja Air Flight 213, gone, but never forgotten.